Good evening. The West's allies in Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance, claimed their first victory of the war tonight. They said they'd captured the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif from the ruling Taliban. The Americans, whose bombing played a big part in the battle, are talking about Taliban troops fleeing. Tonight, our Ministry of Defence said Mazar-e-Sharif would be a crucial toehold in Afghanistan for coalition forces. Paul Davis is following developments.
After weeks of bombing the Taliban front lines, at last it appears the coalition has achieved the breakthrough it has been pursuing. It has been a deliberate strategy for the American planes to target Taliban defences where they face the opposing Northern Alliance forces. And today the alliance is claiming its fighters have entered the key northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif, a city the Americans would prize as a forward base for their own military. The Northern Alliance advance on Mazar-e-Sharif has been steady and relentless. Earlier this week, it was reported they'd taken the districts of Kashende, Akupruk, Shurgar and Sangcharek. And now they say they've broken through Taliban lines in the city itself. Alliance forces are reported to have entered the city from the south at the Puli Iman Bukri bridge. And an opposition spokesman says the Taliban have abandoned the city. These were the scenes when the Taliban took Mazar 4 years ago. Tonight, Taliban commanders are being quoted by local news agencies admitting they've lost control of their stronghold. The
desert operated a prominent opposition leader. Abdul Haq was a veteran Mujahideen warlord and in this fight an ally of America. He could have played a key role in defeating the Taliban. This is how he described his mission only a few days ago.
What I'm working on in these days, putting all these different people together, different commanders together, not to become my army, it's a force which to go together and get rid of the bad guys and help the king to come back and establish peace and security, and we all work for the country.
Neko Khel, controlled by the Taliban south of the Panjshir River, suffered civilian casualties, as did Gana Khel and Honahor in Northern Alliance territory. Our chief correspondent Alex Thompson is there.
From their bombed-out government building, Northern Alliance soldiers survey the front line with the Taliban. But now they're overlooking a river valley where the United States bombed not one but 3 civilian villages yesterday, 2 on their own side in Northern Alliance territory. In the foreground here on the fertile river plain, Gana Khel. It's populated, they're still working the fields here today. The soldiers wanted us to see what had happened. An American bomb yesterday afternoon injured at least 8 people and killed this man's wife.
We're angry. They came to our village and killed us. What had we done?
7-year-old Anur Gul had been staying with his aunt and returned to find his home blown to bits.
I stayed there 2 nights. When I came home, I saw everybody was injured and I was the only one left.
So for the United States now, a real dilemma. Continue the low level of bombing, which happened here for 5 days, and the Taliban can probably withstand that, perhaps indefinitely. Or increase the intensity of the bombing. And you run the risk that what happened yesterday may happen again, that you'll bomb 3 villages, 2 of which are effectively on your own side.
Miles away. The mother, Shakila, is stable with several shrapnel wounds. 12-year-old Aziza's eye is not threatened by the head wound she suffered, and 1-year-old Laikan's injuries are thankfully superficial, unlike his brother, who was killed in the attack. South of here, across the lines, more pictures have been released of the destruction caused by American bombing in Kabul. The Al Jazeera TV station says this bomb hit the northeastern suburb of Makrorian. Several bodies were pulled from the rubble, including 3 children. It's reported that 9 people were killed, a whole family wiped out in their home. It is the 4th time American bombers are reported to have hit people's houses in this suburb. The Americans say they are convinced that Makrorian is where the main Taliban defense lines begin. Whilst the military effectiveness of this war remains largely unknown, the civilian pain is daily more apparent. Alex Thompson, Channel 4 News, north of Kabul in Afghanistan.
It exploded behind us. But as night fell, the Alliance commander at Bagram expressed satisfaction at the US bombing.
This will hurt Taliban morale, and when we get the order, we will break through their lines.
but the Taliban still have some fight left in them. This was their artillery hitting a Northern Alliance position where the soldiers ran for cover. On the Alliance side, new uniforms are being issued to the troops amid rumours of offensive action. But it's still not clear if or when a march on Kabul will begin. Julian Mannion, ITN at the Bagram Air Base near Kabul.
The fight to the Taliban, carpet bombing their trenches and gun positions north of Kabul. And in the southern city of Kandahar, the Taliban stronghold, we were shown some of the unintended results of the bombardment. These boys were digging through the remains of a row of shops, including a pharmacy and a motorcycle parts depot. Local residents wanted to know why US bombs had targeted them. There's nothing connected to the Taliban around here, this man says. The Americans only want to stop us feeding our families. In point of fact, a heavily damaged Taliban ministry building stood nearby. Evidence like this may be less than wholly convincing, and the Americans could well dismiss it as propaganda. But what's harder to deny is that the anger felt by people here seems to be directed not at the Taliban, but at the United States. And the Taliban, on this evidence, are very much in control, at least here in their shattered backyard. Despite the pounding they're taking, these fighters seem in good spirits, playful in a menacing sort of way with us, their foreign guests. And among senior officials like the foreign minister, there's no panic, more a strange mood of confidence. The Taliban aren't running, Mr. Mutawakkil told us. The Americans should come down and fight us on the ground. Then they'd see who'd run. Throughout this trip, our passports, like our personal safety, are firmly in the hands of our hosts. We might be representatives of an aggressive foreign power, but we remain to them guests worthy of respect. Tonight, Kandahar and its bewildered inhabitants are bracing themselves for yet another night of bombing. To a visitor, what seems most astonishing is the stoicism of its people. Whenever peace does return here, for them it can't come soon enough. Simon Ingram, BBC News, Kandahar.
Day by day, the American bombing continues. It's not overwhelming by any means, but it is enough to persuade the Northern Alliance that the time's coming for them to make their move. And so, within sight of the front line they'll have to break through, the Northern Alliance staged a display of firepower. They know the Americans have their doubts about the alliance's chances. They know some people in Washington openly question whether it wouldn't be better to send in American ground forces first. And they know the Americans are still uncertain whether they really want the Northern Alliance to dominate Kabul anyway. But the alliance put on quite an impressive show with the new equipment the Russians have been sending them. They've now got some good, serviceable Russian tanks. Quite an elderly design, dating back to the early 60s, but this isn't in any sense a high-tech war. Plus Russian armoured personnel carriers. And there are also a number of rocket launchers on display, which their other big ally, Iran, has supplied them with. And the Northern Alliance president, Burhanuddin Rabbani, promised them they would capture Kabul quite soon now, as he put it. Elsewhere, he's been more specific. It had happened, he said, before the start of the fasting month of Ramadan, in less than a fortnight. As if to underline the point, American bombs were hitting Taliban positions not far away. And soon the Americans were dropping leaflets over Taliban lines, calling on them to surrender. The Northern Alliance are negotiating with a number of Taliban commanders to get them to come over directly the attack begins. Within the next couple of days, the leaders of the Northern Alliance will be holding a top-level meeting to decide how and when to start the big push on Kabul. Some of them feel that the pressure's building up so much, it's going to be impossible to stop them now. Tonight, the Northern Alliance were busy firing rockets at the Taliban front line. And the tracer shows where Kabul, only 25 miles away from us here, was taking another American hammering. John Simpson.
Good evening. The Taliban's local enemies in Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance, put on a show of force today, suggesting that they might be about to take on the Taliban in a new assault. The Northern Alliance, who are backed and supplied by the Americans, paraded uniformed troops and tanks. It took place in the rebel-held town of Jabal Siraj. From there, our correspondent Julian Mannion sent this report.
Once again, American bombs rained down on the Taliban front line near Kabul. Today, just one B-52 strike and several attacks by smaller jets. The explosions were visible from a makeshift parade ground in the village of Jabal Siraj, where the Northern Alliance staged a major public relations exercise. Several thousand soldiers paraded in their new Russian-made uniforms, and a few of their serviceable tanks rumbled past. It was a determined effort to show that the alliance is not just a motley collection of warlords and tribal groups, but is an organized government with an effective army. The alliance's military strongman, General Fahim, reviewed the troops, while their president, Burhanuddin Rabbani, declared that they now have 20,000 men under arms. While the soldiers here carried out a live fire exercise, other alliance troops were battling to capture the strategic northwestern city of Mazar-i-Sharif. Their drive is apparently backed by American warplanes and special forces troops, but tonight it's not clear how far they have managed to advance. The alliance's plans for the vital Kabul front are also shrouded in uncertainty.
If the Northern Alliance attempts to advance, these are the men who will march on Kabul. Today they've put on a fine display, but many questions remain. Are there enough of them? Do they have enough equipment? And above all, has the Northern Alliance achieved that degree of political acceptability that will permit Washington to give them the green light?
The US government is boosting its support for the alliance. Americans, perhaps special forces troops, have been spotted at this new well-guarded airfield just behind the lines. It seems that Washington wants results, and helping the alliance may be the only way to get them. Julian Mannion, ITN in Jabal Siraj, Afghanistan.
Anti-Taliban forces of the Northern Alliance claim to be continuing their advances. 2 days after capturing the key town of Mazar-i-Sharif, they say they have taken more villages to the west and to the south on the main road to Kabul. Certainly the Taliban admit they are pulling their forces back, possibly to reorganize and stiffen defenses around their southern strongholds. The military breakthrough has come as ministers confirmed that British troops are on the ground in Afghanistan, supporting and liaising with the opposition fighters. The Defense Secretary said reports that Osama bin Laden may have nuclear material made action all the more imperative.
We're certainly aware that he has some material that could contribute to a nuclear weapon. We're not convinced at this stage that he is capable of producing a nuclear bomb. But certainly we have to be very careful. This is a thoroughly dangerous man, and that's why we're having to deal with him in this way.
The Ministry of Defence will not identify the British troops, but they are almost certainly few in number and members of the SAS or Special Boat Service. They are trained to gather intelligence, identify targets for airstrikes and call in American warplanes. American B-52 bombers have again pounded Taliban troop positions north of Kabul, though the opposition forces there have yet to launch an offensive. Their spokesman says victory is vital.
There is a unique opportunity for achieving peace in Afghanistan, for getting rid of the menaces prevailing in a part of Afghanistan, and also for helping the people of Afghanistan.
Inside Kabul, Taliban militiamen have been stopping and searching vehicles, a first sign of increased nervousness among the city's defenders. The government believes it has been a very good 48 hours for the international coalition against terrorism, and they say the momentum of the military campaign is now with them. As one official put it, the Taliban are now hurting. Kevin Dunn, ITN, at the Ministry of Defence.
I asked him how much we could believe of their claims of success in the north.
Well, I think we can believe them. Since the fall of Mazar-i-Sharif, it's been quite clear that the position of the other Taliban forces further over to the northeast was extremely tenuous. Today it appears that they've been...
The Taliban's Ministry of the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice is no more. I spoke to a resident of Mazar-i-Sharif, Haji Shafiullah, and with the help of a translator, asked him if people were happy that the Taliban had been overthrown.
Yes, that's right. Everyone here was happy when the city was captured, and they are happy now. Everyone is hoping that the schools and universities will soon be open to women, and women can go to work and the offices which they did before. They are happy and hopeful.
And what will this mean for the women in Mazar-e-Sharif? Will they be much freer now and be able to cast off the veil?
Yes, even yesterday, which was the first day, women were able to go to Mazar-e-Sharif and to the mosque of Rawza Ali for the first time in the past few years.
And how do people feel about the American bombing? Should it continue?
I think that the key to the Taliban resistance is broken. We hope that in the very near future, the whole of Afghanistan will be captured and cleared. So we hope that the bombing will be over soon.
A resident of Mazar-e-Sharif speaking to me earlier. Now, stop the bombing or people will starve. That was the message from a host of aid agencies 3 weeks ago. But Tony Blair and George Bush said no. Now, with large parts of Afghanistan due to be cut off by winter snows in a matter of days, time is running out for tens of thousands of people.
Well, half the country. They likened a series of seizures of key Taliban towns to the fall of dominoes and say the Taliban have now lost their main fighting force. The alliance say they've seized the northeastern city of Taloqan, thereby nearly completing opposition domination across the Afghan north. They also claim they've captured the city of Puli Kumri, north of Kabul. If true, that would allow an advance down the main road to the capital. Our World Affairs editor John Simpson is with Northern Alliance forces close to Kabul.
The big push on Kabul, long awaited, is now very close. The Northern Alliance has been moving its Russian-supplied tanks up to positions close to the front line. The American bombing, though still far from being intensive, as the Northern Alliance continue to complain, has nevertheless become a little stronger now that the moment for the attack approaches. This is the man who'll command the move on Kabul, General Bismillah, bluff, optimistic character who knows the American bombing has done a lot of his work for him. Treachery could do some more of it. This commander is informing the others about a message he's just received from a senior Taliban officer promising to change sides when the attack begins. But as they prepare themselves for the coming battle, the Northern Alliance commanders find the American warning not to capture Kabul rather puzzling. They announced a month ago that they intended to stop short of taking the city.
But war is always a complete lottery in which there are rarely any certainties. Maybe it won't be nearly as easy as the Northern Alliance are hoping. Maybe if and when they do get to Kabul, something will happen to draw them into the city after all. The closer it gets, the harder it is to be sure. John Simpson, BBC News, 25 miles north of Kabul.
At Ground Zero, they read the names of 86 nations who lost citizens 2 months ago today. For George Bush, in the ruins of the World Trade Center, Veterans Day 2001 is about the war here and now, as well as America's victims of past conflicts. US-led forces, he says, will liberate but not conquer Afghanistan, reinforcing his blunt message to the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance. Stop short of the capital, Kabul. You're only part of the political future.
We will encourage our friends to head south across the Shamali Plains, but not into the city of Kabul itself. We believe we can accomplish our military missions by that strategy.
Derek.
Good evening. It's been confirmed for the first time that British Special Forces are tonight already on the ground in Afghanistan. Ministers aren't saying how many soldiers are involved, but they have revealed they're working closely with the Northern Alliance. In the United States, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld admitted he was concerned about reports that Osama bin Laden has nuclear weapons. Kevin Dunn reports.
These are the opposition forces which British troops are actively assisting on the ground in Afghanistan. Confirming their deployment for the first time, ministers refused to give details in order to safeguard their operational. These men, filmed in Sierra Leone last year, are probably members of the SAS. They are highly trained in intelligence gathering and communications and are often used to identify targets and call in airstrikes. Confirmation came as Osama bin Laden was reported to have made another videotaped message, explicitly admitting his Al-Qaeda network carried out the September 11 attacks. He is also believed to have access to some nuclear material, though not a bomb.
Taliban front line north of Kabul as Washington urged restraint in any Northern Alliance drive towards the capital. One B-52 strike landed about half a mile away from us as we drove to Alliance forward positions. There we found Alliance troops watching with satisfaction as bombs fell on their enemies next to the road to Kabul. These men say that they are ready to move forward, but even as the Alliance brings up its heavy weapons, President Bush has made it clear that it should not attempt to take over the Afghan capital.
These tanks have been brought up to a forward position just a few hundred yards from the front line over there, and they're ready for the order to advance. It's an order that could come as soon as tonight or tomorrow if political factors do not interfere with the Northern Alliance's plans.
Soon after we left, the Alliance tanks were shelled by the Taliban. Some of their guns have clearly survived the American airstrikes. Today, the Alliance Foreign Minister said little about the Kabul front, but preferred to dwell on the defeats that the Taliban are suffering in the north.
Taliban forces in northern Afghanistan, those who have retreated from Mazar-e-Sharif, from Samangan, from other parts of northern Afghanistan, they are fully encircled. They have no way, no escape.
And here
reports of Taliban forces in headlong retreat as the alliance, supported by American air power, has advanced much faster than expected. Tonight their tanks are less than 5 miles from the capital, Kabul. The alliance now control most of the north after capturing the strategic prize of Mazar-e-Sharif on Friday. Their fighters have now entered the western city of Herat, and it's reported that Bamiyan and Talakan have also fallen. Tonight, alliance tanks are now very close to Kabul, but they say they won't enter the city immediately. Our World Affairs editor John Simpson, who's with the Northern Alliance, on how they broke the Taliban defences.
In the end, it was practically a walkover. The Northern Alliance had the firepower, discipline, the will to win, and most important of all, they had the huge destructive force of the American bombing. Any idea that President Bush had somehow vetoed the Northern Alliance's move on Kabul was swiftly disproved. It was American forward observers who called in airstrikes to ease the Northern Alliance's way through the Taliban front line. Here, the Northern Alliance troops we're with have realized that a Taliban tank has broken through and is heading their way. It was virtually the only act of defiance the Taliban staged. But the Americans summoned up an airstrike, and with cold surgical precision, the tank was snuffed out in one. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there was virtually no fight left on the Taliban front line. It was time to make the breakthrough. We followed in behind a number of jeeps which headed through the Taliban line in a protective cloud of dust. In each place we passed, we found that the Taliban had just surrendered or been killed. There was little sign of resistance. Still, this unfortunate Northern Alliance soldier had taken a bullet in the chest, and since there was an almost total lack of medical facilities, he'll have been lucky to survive. We followed some Northern Alliance soldiers who were hunting down a group of 4 Pakistani Taliban volunteers. They killed them all.
Pakistan. Pakistan.
An elderly Turkish Taliban volunteer is assaulted by a Northern Alliance commander. Then he's led away. He and the others were terrified, but once they'd been captured like this, they'll all have survived. Altogether, it took less than an hour for the Northern Alliance to carve their way through from the front line to the second defensive line of the Taliban. Well, this is it, the second line of defense around Kabul. The Taliban have all gone, either been taken prisoners or run for it back in the direction of Kabul, which is now only about 12 or 13 kilometers away from here. It's a rout. The Northern Alliance are just carving through like a knife through butter. By nightfall, they'd gone so far, so fast, that they were exhausted. In the darkness, we came across another Taliban prisoner, an Afghan. He'd been injured, but wasn't being ill-treated. He told us he and his Taliban comrades had never dreamt the attack could have come so fast. They were, he said, completely demoralized. Tomorrow, the Northern Alliance confidently expect to capture Kabul, and unless their leaders stop them, they'll enter the city, in spite of all the warnings and the promises to the contrary. John Simpson, BBC News, 10 miles outside Kabul.
Opposition troops in North Afghanistan has been dramatic. Few expected Taliban control to evaporate so fast. Until Friday, the opposition Northern Alliance forces controlled only patches of territory, probably no more than 10% of the country. But once Mazar-e-Sharif fell, they swiftly extended their control. Today, the last remaining Taliban pockets of resistance in the north are being challenged. The city of Kunduz is encircled. If it falls, a key supply route from Tajikistan opens up. The western city of Herat is under attack, a gateway, if its fall is confirmed, to Taliban heartlands in the south. And unconfirmed opposition gains also include the central Bamiyan province and the southwestern border town of Zaranj, where they claim Taliban troops just ran away. The question now is what will happen to Kabul. Jubilant Northern Alliance soldiers have halted their advance a few miles to the north. Their political spokesman insists they won't take the city, but will the commanders listen to him?
We will not enter Kabul at this stage. We will stop before Kabul in a convenient front line.
Inside Kabul earlier today, streets were emptier and truckloads of fighters were seen leaving the city. But are the Taliban really in disarray, or is this a tactical retreat to southern Afghanistan, where they can count on more local support and the Northern Alliance will not be welcome? So far, Northern Alliance gains have mirrored the ethnic regions who support them, the Persian-speaking Tajiks and Northern Uzbeks. In central Afghanistan, they're close to the Shiite Hazaras. But southern Afghanistan is dominated by the Pashtun, the largest ethnic group and closest to the Taliban. Kandahar, the Taliban's heavily bombed heartland, will be much more difficult to win over, harder for opposition troops to attack, and despite Western attempts, few signs so far that local leaders will contemplate defections. This is where the real fight for Taliban control will be. Bridget Kendall, BBC News.
Actuated by routes, this was a pretty complete victory.
Yes, it was. So far, at any rate, they haven't actually captured Kabul yet, of course, but they're going to. I think there was a lot of misinformation and a lot of propaganda about the Taliban, what fantastic fighters they were. Those of us who've seen them fight in the past knew that they weren't on
the road to Kabul.
Of Afghanistan. They have done so with the support of overwhelming American air power and guidance on the ground from American and British special forces.
We started our operation, our offensive on the front line north of Kabul around 11:30 in the morning today. We have made advance as far as 15 kilometers towards Kabul.
The Defence Secretary visited the command bunker at Permanent Joint Headquarters today and praised the role played by British soldiers in the breakthrough.
They've played a very significant part, and it's an important role in ensuring, alongside Americans in very similar positions, that there is a consistency between the bombing attack and the movement on the ground. It's about timing, it's about coordination, about ensuring that there are common objectives, and as I think you've seen over the weekend, that work has now proved very successful.
The Alliance advance, once it began, was swift and incisive. On Friday, Mazar-e-Sharif fell into their hands. In the last 36 hours, the alliance have taken Taloqan, their former headquarters, Puli Kumri, an important town on the road to Kabul, Bamiyan in the centre of the country, and to the west, Kala Inao. And they claim to have taken Herat. 2 months ago, the map of Afghanistan looked like this, with only pockets of Northern Alliance territory. Now the north of the country is almost entirely under Alliance control, with the way open for a push for the capital Kabul, though southern Afghanistan and the stronghold of Kandahar is still in Taliban hands. Pictures from Abu Dhabi television show anti-aircraft fire directed at American warplanes over Kabul, but Pentagon officials say Taliban resistance is light, and there are reports of a number of Taliban vehicles leaving the capital for the southwest. The Arabic station also showed pictures of what it said were victims of the latest bombing raids. It is not clear if some of the injured were combatants. The sudden escalation of fighting has claimed the lives of 3 foreign journalists. French reporter Johan Sutton, filmed here only a few days ago, was killed with a French colleague and a German.
The Northern Alliance claimed tonight that it was now, at one point, only 4 miles from the Afghan capital, Kabul. Taliban resistance seems to have crumbled there, at least. The alliance have promised they won't try to take the city in deference to the fact that they are not by any stretch of the imagination representative of the Afghan people as a whole. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, has been following the latest developments in the Afghan war.
Well, tonight there are credible reports that the Northern Alliance has captured Herat in the west. It's next in importance only to Kandahar and Kabul. From there, it's gently downhill all the way on the Kandahar road. It's also reported tonight that the Northern Alliance troops are close to taking the capital of Nimruz province. That would be another body blow to the Taliban. But the most significant advances over the day were here north of Kabul. And it'll all be a great shock to the Taliban and their supporters.
It was dramatic changes. And it was too fast. It was unexpected even for the people in northern Afghanistan. Militarily, I think it was a big defeat to the Taliban. They do not lost the territory, a big part of Afghanistan, but also thousands of fighters.
We now know that the Northern Alliance has taken pretty much all of the Shomali plain during today's fighting. They're now reported to be within 6 or 7 miles of Kabul. This means 2 things: that the Northern Alliance's momentum of recent days has been maintained, and that Bagram Air Base is probably now secure. Until the weekend, that base had been within Taliban mortar range. Now, if it's not, it opens up the base for use by American special forces, gunship helicopters, the works. Satellite imagery of Bagram shows that the huge surface of the airfield is still undamaged, and if we zoom in, we can also see some of the extensive facilities like shelters here for fighters. And during the Soviet war, they had up to 200 aircraft based there, so it's a considerable prize. The alliance is itching to take Kabul, and in truth, if they do so, it'll help keep the pressure on the Taliban and end the war more quickly. The top of the Kabul Gorge in the east, Karga in the west, and Darulaman in the south. But of course, if you stop the Northern Alliance going in, and it's a big if, given the spirit they've shown today in their advance, you do leave a vacuum. There's a role in place of the alliance fighters for an international force, probably under a UN mandate. It would provide a valuable mission for those German, French, Italian, and even British troops that have been vaguely promised to the international effort.
There could be a possibility of a UN-supported Afghan government going into Kabul, running the city, becoming the sort of central authority in Afghanistan, but at the same time acting with very limited power.
Good evening. The Afghan capital Kabul has fallen to the Northern Alliance with barely a shot fired. The Taliban fled in the middle of the night. They're reported to be in headlong retreat, their leader Mullah Omar calling on them to turn around and fight, not behave like slaughtered chickens. There are reports of executions and a massacre of Taliban fighters in the town of Mazar-e Sharif, but Kabul itself is calm tonight. Some American soldiers are already in the city. In a moment, the BBC's Raghi Omar, who was in Kabul as the Taliban fled. But first, John Simpson, who walked into the city ahead of the Northern Alliance early this morning.
It was just before dawn that the wild dash for Kabul developed. Thousands of soldiers intent on capturing the capital. It seemed to take no time at all to cover the 12 or so miles. As we drew nearer to Kabul, the grim evidence of battle. These were former supporters of the Northern Alliance who'd switched sides and joined the Taliban. No mercy for them. Then we saw they'd captured another man. The presence of our camera probably saved his life. He was paralyzed with terror. By now, there were no Taliban left to resist. Then came the critical moment. Would the Northern Alliance simply race on and pour into Kabul itself, even though they'd undertaken not to? The commander in charge was determined not to let it happen. He ordered the armored vehicles to block the way. The great advance was stopped in its tracks. But Kabul lay temptingly close to us now. A small BBC team decided to head on into the city alone. We went on foot, so no one would think we were soldiers. We ploughed on down the hill. At this stage, there were only a few local people around us.
Well, this is it. We're walking into Kabul city. We don't seem to have any problems around us. There's only people that are friendly and are saying, chanting, I'm afraid, kill the Taliban. But as we understand it, as we walk in here, there aren't going to be that many Taliban anyway.
It was 7:53 a.m. local time. Kabul was a free city after 5 years of perhaps the most extreme religious system anywhere on earth. Under the Taliban, girls couldn't be educated. Men could be whipped for shaving. All music was banned. It was forbidden to play chess, to sing, to possess a picture of any living creature. No wonder they're happy. But there was an ugly price to be paid for so much repression. In the streets, in the ditches, foreign volunteers for the Taliban, especially Arabs and Pakistanis, ended up dead, lynched or shot. They were particularly loathed. In the surroundings of the Intercontinental Hotel in the center of Kabul, we caught sight of a group of Arab and Pakistani Taliban trying desperately to escape the vengeance of the people of Kabul. A group of soldiers is hunting them down. Another one's bringing up some grenades to flush them out. They're trapped inside this building. But some local people have caught one of the Taliban group. He's an Arab. They make him call the others to get them to come out and surrender. And eventually it works. They're brought out as prisoners. This man is a Pakistani. The Arab gets particularly brutal treatment. In the jeep, there are other Taliban prisoners. This one is an Arab, perhaps an Egyptian. The other two are Afghans. This is the end of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And with luck, the end of this country's links with international terrorism as well. We went to a house where an Arab member of Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda organization lived and worked. The place had just been ransacked by an angry crowd. Inside, there were explosives on the floor in one room, and anti-personnel mines in another. Elsewhere, there was a printing press. The notices on the wall here were all connected with Al-Qaeda, including a training certificate and an organizational chart. Recruits had obviously been taught here. Upstairs, we found all sorts of documents connected with explosives. For instance, this manual in English with handwritten notes in Arabic for blowing up bridges and buildings. There were all sorts of guides about timing mechanisms and booby traps. And if all that's finished now, so is the system which intruded so brutally in everyone's lives. Suddenly you don't have to wear a beard anymore if you don't want to. Shaving is a way of demonstrating your liberation. So is showing your face in public if you're a woman. And there's one thing more. Children can fly kites again. Freedom's in the air here. John Simpson, BBC News, Kabul.
The people of Kabul have experienced a remarkable 24 hours as Taliban forces fled the Northern Alliance advance. The BBC's Raghi Omar has been inside the Afghan capital since last week. This is his account of the night that Kabul fell.
The B-52s were still flying high over Kabul yesterday afternoon. Nervously, this broken city and its people waited.
There's not much people can do, but where do they go? All they can do is stay at home and hope for the best.
That night, my colleague William Reeve was sending a report when this happened.
Jesus Christ. Down in the basement. Down in the basement. Get down there. Right.
An American missile had completely destroyed a building barely 50 meters from the BBC bureau. With no choice, we all left immediately, fearful that more strikes would follow. Kabul was empty and frightening. We were stopped at this checkpoint by Taliban forces. Like all retreating armies, they were edgy and tense. There were dozens of jeeps and trucks full of Taliban fighters and weapons trying to leave under cover of darkness. Only 2 days earlier, this fighter in the black turban had threatened to shoot us. By dawn this morning, it was clear the city's fate had been sealed.
Oh, there are a lot of soldiers coming our way.
We saw the first group of Northern Alliance soldiers fan out across the city, but the capital was now in a vacuum and lawlessness was spreading. It seemed there was no one to stop the settling of some scores. Any Arabs suspected of fighting with the Taliban or Bin Laden and who hadn't left the city were lynched, their bodies mutilated. For several hours, it seemed that anyone with a gun was in control. There was chaos at government buildings and main intersections. This man told me that the armed men were actually looting. It was exactly the kind of disorder that the Western allies must have been fearing. It was by late afternoon that finally some calm had returned to the streets.
As the hours have gone by, there are more and more Northern Alliance troops in evidence right the way through Kabul. But the city still faces one critical and potentially dangerous situation. The military reality here on the ground is still far ahead of any political plans to bring stability to the capital.
Tonight, the city is quiet, having been spared further destruction. Raghi Omar, BBC News, Kabul.
With Kabul taken, the increasingly confident opposition forces are advancing on Taliban positions across the country. The Northern Alliance now controls most of northern Afghanistan and is putting pressure on the Taliban's last remaining northern city of Kunduz. In the east, the Taliban's hold over Jalalabad is reportedly weakening, but they remain in control at their southern stronghold, Kandahar. Well, John Simpson's in Kabul now. John, are the Taliban really finished?
Yes, I think they are, Michael. I really do think they've finished. I think they were always a house of cards I think really all it needed was a sharp blow of some kind, and it would all fall apart, which is exactly what's happened. I don't, though, think we should rule out the possibility that that famous concept that Pakistan came up with first, the notion of the moderate Taliban, might surface again. And there are indeed moderate and perfectly reasonable people within the Taliban. Not very many of them, but there are some who could possibly come across and form some part of some new grouping. But the old Taliban, no, they are completely finished.
Is there a danger now, though, that the Northern Alliance might get out of control, that the Afghans have merely exchanged one tyranny for another?
I don't really think so. Of course, they played their part, and it was only one part in a very bad period between 1992 and 1996. But that was very much when outside countries, particularly Pakistan, but also others, were playing all sorts of games in this country and keeping this country in a terrible state. Nowadays, well, things are different. The main difference is that the Americans have got so much involved, and the Northern Alliance know they wouldn't be here tonight if it weren't for the American bombing. And if the Americans decide that the Northern Alliance aren't doing the job right, they'll pull the plugs on them, and that'd be the finish of them. So they've got a very powerful incentive to behave properly and to keep a tight control on their people.
John Simpson in Kabul, thanks very much. Today the embassy was abandoned and the ambassador headed back to Afghanistan to talk to the Taliban leadership. From Islamabad, our special correspondent Ben Brown.
At the Taliban's embassy here in Pakistan, the mood was distinctly hostile. Taliban diplomats looked like they were leaving for the last time, taking with them computers containing sensitive information. The ambassador himself is thought to have flown out of Islamabad. There was no comment about the Taliban's defeat, even from an embassy that's been its propaganda mouthpiece for the last few weeks. Before the diplomats left, the father of one of 8 Western aid workers held prisoner by the Taliban came searching for news of their fate.
I just asked them to please verify that the detainees are safe and where they're going to be taken. That's all.
The answer he got was that the Taliban have moved them from Kabul to the city of Kandahar. Pakistan helped create the Taliban. It is the only country still to recognize them. But now they've been ousted, it's worried about what will happen in the state next door.
Pakistan holds to the view that the Northern Alliance forces must not occupy Kabul. Pakistan would like to see an early return to durable peace and stability to Afghanistan.
And Pakistan's President, General Musharraf, has called for a United Nations force to police Kabul. He fears the Pashtun ethnic group, common to both Pakistan and Afghanistan, will be excluded from power by the Northern Alliance. General Musharraf will be furious the Northern Alliance moved into Kabul, even when they promised not to. Now he can only hope they will keep another promise, and that is to help form a broadly based government representing all ethnic groups. Ben Brown, BBC News, Islamabad.
One reason the power vacuum in Kabul needs solving: Taliban prisoners of war. Their regime was brutal enough, but away from Western cameras, who's to stop any revenge killings? For all the jubilation, there's much disquiet about the Northern Alliance takeover. It wasn't meant to be like this. For weeks, the US and its allies tried in vain to get the rival anti-Taliban factions to agree on a common future, but Kabul fell too quickly.
We need a UN presence there as soon as possible, and we need, obviously, to make sure that we're making as quick progress as we possibly can on assembling all the different elements that need to go to make up that broad-based successor regime.
The United Nations doesn't actually want Afghanistan to become yet another UN protectorate. They'd rather the Afghans ruled themselves. So, to fill the vacuum, they want to convene an urgent meeting of all the Afghan tribal factions as soon as possible to approve plans for a new transitional administration to run Afghanistan with UN help over the next 2 years. The longer-term future would be decided later by a full traditional tribal council. And as for security, Well, the UN say Afghanistan is too dangerous for UN troops. Better, they say, would be a multinational force, or best of all, to get the Afghans to police themselves. And so far, the Northern Alliance are insisting they will agree to share power.
We are for the establishing of a government of national unity, which could represent all ethnics of Afghanistan.
And from Washington this evening came confirmation American forces are already in Kabul.
There are a very small number of U.S. forces in the city of Kabul. There are not sufficient forces to monitor or police the entire city. They are a sufficient number that they can give advice and counsel.
One American team was even caught on camera today, being shown round Bagram Airport, just north of the capital. But they aren't there to keep the...
The world's most fearsome religious fundamentalist government has been toppled. It happened with lightning speed, so fast that no one can quite predict what happens next. Should the UN be brought in to police a country where guns seem more available than square meals? While Afghans may be wreaking vengeance on foreigner fundamentalists, the biggest foreign quarry, Osama bin Laden, remains at large.
Few of us who have been here over the past week could have believed that Kabul would have fallen so quickly. The chain of events had been set several days before, particularly with the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif, and as the Northern Alliance cut through swathe after swathe of territory. But the actual fall of the Afghan capital really began 24 hours ago.
By late last evening, it was clear that all was lost. Kabul was empty of civilians and felt frightening. We were stopped at this checkpoint by Taliban forces. Like all retreating armies, they were edgy and tense.
Symbol of their fanatically religious government. On a hillside above the city, shots rang out as Alliance soldiers hunted down a few Taliban who had failed to escape with the rest. After a chase on foot, the men surrendered and were led away to face Northern Alliance justice. We found other evidence of the Taliban retreat, a vehicle wrecked by an American airstrike.
This is the debris of defeat. A Taliban pickup truck which was packed with their soldiers, destroyed by an American missile as it tried to flee Kabul. The bodies of the dead soldiers, hideously mangled, have been hauled over to the side of the road over there.
Local people claimed that the dead men were Arabs. Nearby, we found a military base which the Americans bombed repeatedly in recent weeks, destroying armor and wrecking buildings. And late yesterday, as the Taliban were pulling out, the Americans bombed the villa which had housed their head of security for Kabul. The bombs missed their target because the man had fled 2 days before. I met the owner of the house, who had been forced to hand it over to the Taliban.
They weren't going to pay the rent, and they told us, if you come in this area around Wazir Akbar Khan, we will shoot you. Yes. And
you weren't allowed to come back to your own house?
Yes.
In the streets, barbers have been doing a roaring trade, shaving off beards that the Taliban insisted on. But it was women who suffered most from the bigotry of the Taliban, who forced them to wear the veil. Against the objections of men standing nearby, I asked this woman about life under Taliban rule. They were cruel, she told me. They beat us. Now it is the Northern Alliance who hold power. By lunchtime, floods of troops were entering the city, breaking their government's pledge that they would remain outside. The takeover will make America's declared aim of building a broad coalition government more difficult. But Washington will still be celebrating this resounding defeat inflicted on the Taliban. Julian Mannion, ITN, Kabul.
Some districts falling to the civilian people. Local tribal elders are taking over the district administration, together with the religious scholars of the area. And this is, as a matter of fact, happening in many areas. And we are negotiating also with certain Taliban leaders. We hope that events in the southwestern parts of Afghanistan will not require a military solution. We hope that everything will be done in a peaceful manner, which I believe is good for all.
So the Taliban are effectively losing control even of that area that you're in now?
Absolutely, sir.
Now, who is actually taking over from them then?
Just the civilian people, the tribal chiefs and the local clergy.
Is there actual fighting?
There is no fighting, sir, no.
Are there people who are actually leaving the Taliban?
Yes, sir, a lot of them are leaving. And we have asked our people to allow these Taliban soldiers and Taliban commanders to reach their homes safely with security.
Are you hearing anything there about the whereabouts of Osama bin Laden?
No, sir, I have no idea about Osama bin Laden. I don't know where he is. But I have an idea about what should be done. I want him out of my country.
When it comes to trying to form a new government for your country, is it acceptable that it's dominated by the Northern Alliance?
We want an Afghanistan in which the government of the country is determined by the will of the majority of the Afghan people.
Victory on the battlefield is certainly a good way to win friends. Overthrowing the Taliban in a month proves that this war on terrorism can achieve results. But the Muslim world will be watching closely to see how the coalition treats Afghanistan after its focus has moved on.
I would simply say to the people of Afghanistan today that this time we will not walk away from you. We have given commitments, we will honor those commitments, both on the humanitarian side and in terms of rebuilding Afghanistan. We are with you for the long term.
President Bush has a Republican's aversion to keeping American troops on the ground for the long term, and Mr. Putin cannot really afford to. One wonders if American interest in Afghanistan will extend beyond the hunt for Osama bin Laden. America does have one very powerful reason for staying involved in Afghanistan. It doesn't want the country to slip back into being a breeding ground for terrorists ever again. Of course, if the previous Republican administration had taken more interest in the region after the Soviets left, then everyone might have been spared these present difficulties. There are officials in this town who now say that they have learned that lesson. With the Taliban out of the way, the American military can now concentrate on trying to isolate and eliminate Osama bin Laden. But these jets also serve as a warning to the Northern Alliance to toe the line.
You know, it's a club that hopefully we'll never have to use it, but it's behind our back. And I think
of celebration. Tonight, the streets of Kabul are quiet. Many Northern Alliance troops have already moved on to pursue the Taliban.
We're used to seeing war from a distance, but what happens when...
Because they would have been bombed or killed, you know, by inaccurate bombardment and those things. And we withdraw. That's...
So you've withdrawn from Kabul. How far will you withdraw? Where will you draw the line?
We are surrounding Kabul.
And you will not withdraw any further than that? You will...
Yeah.
What about Kandahar? There are reports from Kandahar, from Jalalabad, which suggest that there'd also been fighting there. Is the Taliban still in control?
No such reports. I have not received such reports.
So Kandahar and Jalalabad...
About Jalalabad, I received, it was 15 minutes ago, and we contacted, and Taliban had control over Jalalabad.
So what about Kandahar? Will you defend that city? Will you defend the south?
Yeah, we have a plan, and a plan is being worked out for a future war with different tactics, of course.
Guerrilla war?
Different tactics I can't mention. Thank you very much.
Absolutely last question. So the Taliban embassy here in Islamabad is still functioning, they're still defiant, but the defiance is distinctly muted. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News, Islamabad.
Returned to work yesterday for the first time in 5 years, from where she's been urging other women to follow suit. I spoke to her today and asked her what she said in her first broadcast.
Yes, I said, dear sisters, dear mothers, we want to reassure you that you can return to your jobs. We are also asking doctors to return to work.
So how did it feel to be broadcasting freely once again?
Yes, I was very happy and I felt free. I think freedom is a great gift that is given to us by God. Even if you have everything, but you are not free, you can't enjoy what you have.
How much do you think life is going to change for ordinary women in Kabul now?
I hope our government will give women the rights that are given under Islamic law.
The start of the first full day of a new political system, and a new and perhaps easier life. No more American bombing. No more of the ferocious Taliban restrictions on everyday existence. The shops are opening up for the first time since yesterday's momentous changes. It's surprising how fast things are getting back to normal here. People still cheer the Northern Alliance soldiers in the streets, but soon they won't even notice them when they pass. They use containers for a lot of things here, as prefabricated shops, of course, but also as prefabricated prisons. This one holds a group of Taliban prisoners who were captured yesterday. There's a callousness about their treatment which amounts to cruelty, but it's nothing personal. It's simply because they're Pakistanis, and most Afghans blame them and the Arabs who came to join the Taliban for the disasters of the past 5 years of oppression. The Arabs were hated here because they lorded it over the Afghans, and no one more than Osama bin Laden. Today, we discovered the house where bin Laden's family lived in Kabul, and which he used to visit secretly. When we met the landlord, he insisted he had no idea who they were. They moved in last December, he said, and moved out in a hurry 3 weeks ago, leaving the latest installment of rent unpaid.
This is the same little girl, actually. There's 3 pictures, I think, or 2 pictures.
The landlord also showed us some photographs which the family left behind when they hurried off. 4 children and their mother. This is another picture of the mother, probably taken some time ago.
The largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. Local Pashtun tribal leaders all want to be the first to take the city back. This man, Hamid Karzai, fought the Russians and the Taliban. Now he's back inside Afghanistan, reportedly trying to rally support. And there are other groups jockeying for position too. America is hoping groups like this will force the Taliban out of Kandahar and tip the balance in the south. This border between Pakistan and southern Afghanistan is jittery and confused. The signals here are that the Taliban are still in Kandahar and they're still in control, but that their hold on power is becoming increasingly tenuous. Adam Brooks, BBC News, on the Afghan border.
Taliban collapse and their ability to remain a fighting force.
Well, nothing absolutely precise yet, Peter, on either Jalalabad or Kandahar. The situation's there. My guess is that they're still holding on in Kandahar and that they may have actually lost in Jalalabad already, and we just haven't had the final confirmation of it. As for their ability to cling on to power, well, frankly, that's gone, that's vanished. All anybody can do now is think about exit strategies. I'm sure that Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, has got his worked out. I'm equally sure that Osama bin Laden, the al-Qaeda leader, has got his worked out, and both of them may include some kind of, I don't know, Götterdämmerung, some kind of a final solution as far as they're concerned. It's difficult to tell. But for the Taliban as a political organization, finished. As a military organization, almost finished.
Now, you touched on it in your report, but what chance do you give these international efforts to set up a broad-based government? The past has seen such bloody battles.
A few days ago, anti-Taliban forces controlled only 10% of the country up here in the north.
Now they control as much as 80%, so suddenly there's a power vacuum. Now, the British forces on standby to fill that include elements of 16 Air Assault Brigade with its paratroopers and 3 Commando Brigade with its Royal Marines. These are the likely roles: securing air bases like the one at Bagram and clearing unexploded bombs that might be there, guarding aid convoys coming in from the north from Uzbekistan by Mazar-e Sharif, patrolling cities like Kabul to keep watch on the Northern Alliance, and possibly they'd be deployed further south into the Taliban heartland by Kandahar, where bin Laden and his men are at their strongest. American and British special forces have already been helping the Northern Alliance and guiding in the bombers. Now a new, more aggressive mission was revealed today to hunt for bin Laden by stopping vehicles or, as the Pentagon puts it, interdicting the traffic.
With Jeremy Paxman.
London says the Taliban have collapsed. Washington says they can't be written off yet. So are the Taliban a busted flush? Good evening. The Taliban have withdrawn without a fight from their central and eastern heartlands. There are even reports that their spiritual home, the city of Kandahar, is looking vulnerable. The Northern Alliance have got the capital and they've got the kudos. Why should they bend to outside opinion and share power with any other Afghan warlords? The UN official with the job of sorting it all out told the second night in control of the Afghan capital, the Northern Alliance continue to consolidate their grip on power. Outside Kabul, the Taliban seem to have lost control of more places. Local parties, tribes and ethnic groups have declared themselves free of the Taliban in several provinces and set up their own authorities. The Taliban regime's stronghold in the east, Jalalabad, has fallen to a Pashtun militia group, and there are even reports that the Taliban's spiritual capital, Kandahar, is no longer entirely under their control. More about that in a minute, but first let's go to Raghi Omar for the situation in Kabul.
Well, in security terms, it's very calm. It certainly has been all of today, at stark contrast to the early hours of yesterday, when the Northern Alliance hadn't quite got control of the city and the Taliban had already withdrawn, where we saw quite a state of lawlessness. But at the moment, security-wise, I say it's calm, but politically, I'd say very uncertain.
How easy is it for you in Kabul to find out what's going on in other places where the Taliban are said still to be either resisting or equivocating? I mean, do you know what's happening in Kandahar, for example?
No, not with any real accuracy, I don't think. It's very, very difficult. I mean, what news we are receiving is largely through walkie-talkie systems where people can communicate between major towns. There's not really any functioning telephone system, but no real verifiable information that we can confirm. I think one of the key things that you were mentioning, and I think that is being ignored, is...
While faraway states and international agencies have struggled to come up with an ideal formula for a future Afghan government, the men on the spot in Kabul, the Northern Alliance, have wasted no time in seizing control, at least temporarily. Some officials have simply reoccupied the ministries they held before the Taliban conquered the city 5 years ago, and Alliance supporters are once more in control of broadcasting in northern Afghanistan, allowing frivolous music to be played again. Alliance leaders, who now control at least half the country, say they're still prepared to march to the West's tune. They insist they're only keeping order in Kabul, not preempting plans for a future broad-based government. But some residents Newsnight's spoken to already fear there'll be conflicts if officials who've now eased themselves into new jobs refuse to relinquish them in a settlement imposed from outside. And beyond Kabul, it already appears that the old map of Afghanistan is beginning to reassert itself, the patchwork of warlords who tore the country apart before the Taliban brutally imposed order. In Mazar-e Sharif, the city's former master, Abdul Rashid Dostum, appears to be reinforcing his power again with the formation of an independent cabinet. Further west in Herat, the pre-Taliban governor, Ismail Khan, is back in control. In the past, he too ruled his region as a personal fiefdom. Kunduz is the only city in the north where fighting is continuing, but that's also expected to fall soon to local Northern Alliance commanders. General Dostum, a much-feared commander who started his career as a communist general, has no experience of politics outside his own home region in the north. And in the past, he's been an opponent of Burhanuddin Rabbani, the Islamic scholar who heads the Northern Alliance and regards himself as head of state.
A lot of the warlords are going to look for what is in their own immediate interest. Are they going to get money for something? Are they going to be able to re-establish their power in the little villages or among the groups that they are holding? And also the people to whom they are loyal, to make sure that they get into a good, important, powerful position so that their own powers and their own money and their own income is secure.
I met Qazi Kabir, the commander of a region along the Tajik border, a month ago, just after the start of the American bombing campaign in Afghanistan. When I spoke to him on the phone again today, he insisted his fellow generals in the Northern Alliance weren't attempting to grab Dan. Nation building is a very new concept.
Well, there is considerable unease in Pakistan about the way the Northern Alliance appear to have got their feet under the table in Kabul. Earlier I spoke to Sadr Ali, a former Pakistani foreign minister. I asked him if he was at least happy to see the Taliban go.
Well, let me put it this way, that we are not displeased about that. But what we are displeased about is that 65% of the people of Afghanistan who are Pashtuns, what role do they have in the future peace process?
Troops were on standby to fly into Kabul and may even be used in combat operations if necessary. He said several thousand British troops would go to Afghanistan if needed to secure aid routes and airfields. The events of the last few days showed, said Mr. Blair, that the Taliban was in a state of collapse, but that the military job was not finished yet. Here's Kevin Dunn.
After 6 weeks supporting airstrikes against Afghanistan, an RAF air control aircraft returned to its base in Lincolnshire. But as the crewmen were reunited with their families, thousands of other troops were put on 48 hours standby. The Prime Minister told the Commons they could carry out a number of tasks. The major attacks. More than 200 Royal Marine Commandos are already aboard ships in the Arabian Sea. Now more commando groups, units of the Parachute Regiment and of the Royal Engineers are on 2 days' notice to move.
This is about as high as you can get before you actually send anybody off.
Not Taliban stragglers and uncovering some unpleasant Taliban secrets, both left behind in the hasty retreat on Monday night. Beyond the capital, the Northern Alliance is trying to extend its grip across Afghanistan as the Taliban retreats south. American sources are saying tonight the eastern city of Jalalabad has fallen, but to local Pashtun tribes. In the north, meanwhile, tens of thousands of Taliban troops are reported to be hiding in Kunduz, surrounded by alliance forces. The Pentagon says the Taliban retreat to the south could be a deliberate tactic. It says they're regrouping west of Kandahar now. More on that in just a moment, though. First, to Julian Mannion in Kabul on how the Northern Alliance is tightening its hold on the city.
Taliban stragglers are still being hunted down in Kabul. 2 men were set upon by the crowd on suspicion of being members of the fundamentalist army. Their denials did not prevent another punch being thrown by a Northern Alliance soldier. Finally, they were taken away by taxi for investigation. At a Northern Alliance camp, suspects are kept in a lorry container. Inside, 1 Afghan and 4 Pakistanis. They too denied any involvement with the Taliban. One man said he had come to Kabul to work as a male nurse. Another said he was sightseeing. Their guards did not appear convinced. Roles have dramatically reversed in the last 48 hours. This, I discovered, was one of the Taliban's secret prisons, equipped with primitive manacles and basement cells for their enemies. Our interpreter found some chilling documents.
For example, here is written, imprison Amanullah for an unknown time.
An unknown time?
Yeah, yeah.
So that could be as long as they like?
The days are not specified here, just imprisonment.
The prison was next to the former Prime Minister's mansion, from where senior Taliban leaders controlled Kabul and planned their war. Now it is strewn with the debris of a hasty departure. The people of Kabul have been liberated from a bigoted regime that could lock someone up for anything from criticizing its authority to failing to grow a long enough beard. Today they're in the hands of an alliance whose last attempt to rule here in the early 1990s ended in chaos and civil war. It will now be up to the Northern Alliance to prove that they can help to heal the wounds of this ravaged city. The Taliban legacy includes widespread poverty and the oppression of women, who are denied any right to be seen or to express themselves. Today, scores of them, still clad in the suffocating veil which the Taliban required by law, came to collect a handout of free rice. They told me that they had nothing at home to feed their families, and one of them spoke of her hatred of the veil. While an official appealed for calm, a man beside him seized a stick and tried to silence the women before he was restrained. The Northern Alliance is changing the laws, but it still takes courage for a woman to show her face. Elsewhere in the city, refugees who fled are coming back, but it will take time, a lot of time, for anything resembling a normal society to emerge. Julian Mannion, ITN, Kabul.
Had turned against them, and there's fighting around the airport. The Arab satellite station Al Jazeera showed pictures which it said were filmed in Kandahar and showed Taliban fighters in defiant mood, promising to fight on for Osama bin Laden. And now the Taliban have retreated from most of northern Afghanistan. The first food and winter clothes to reach the area from across the border in Uzbekistan arrived today by barge. The United Nations hopes it will be the first of many. The supplies travelled by river from Termez to Hayratun, northeast of Mazar-e-Sharif, the first Taliban city to fall. Our correspondent Andrea Catherwood was the only British journalist to travel with the barge into Afghanistan.
A humanitarian lifeline thrown to Afghanistan. This barge, loaded with food and clothes, opens a vital aid route from Uzbekistan. It's the first boat to cross the Oxus River in 4 years since the Uzbeks sealed their border. The river is the only way to get aid into this region around the city of Mazar-e-Sharif, completely cut off by the fighting. We travelled on a tugboat alongside the barge under the watchful eye of the Uzbek gunboats guarding their border. On the other side, Afghan children waved in surprise at the sight of traffic on the river. And as we approached the port of Hayratun, a huge cheer from men eagerly waiting to unload this precious cargo. The UN could offload 1,000 tons of aid a day to distribute into a region where 1 million people are in desperate need of food to survive the winter.
This port town of Hayratun fell to the opposition forces of the Northern Alliance early on Saturday morning, after what they describe as moderate resistance from the Taliban. The United Nations now feel it is secure enough to offload their aid here, but 40 miles inland in the city of Mazar-e-Sharif, it's a very different story.
There we're hearing unconfirmed reports of fighting, lawlessness and executions. So that last crucial step to deliver this aid to those in need cannot yet be taken. But today a process began which could send...
We've been pretty much stuck here for the past 2 days. We can't go back and we can't go forward because of the fighting going on. Tomorrow morning we're going to be led with a military convoy out of here. The reason we've been held up in a very difficult situation is because of the fighting in Kunduz. There are an estimated 20,000 Taliban supporters fighting. 6,000 of those, we believe, are so-called foreign supporters of the Taliban. They come from Chechnya, they come from Pakistan, they're Arabs, and they are, many of them, supporters of the Al-Qaeda group. Now the fighting there is intense because they have nowhere to go. And what is effectively happening at the moment is they are surrounded by Northern Alliance troops who are moving in. Now, I had a rather chilling conversation with Northern Alliance General today, General Kassar, and he told me that he has ordered his men to shoot on sight all of those from the Taliban side. The reason is that many of the foreign Taliban supporters are coming forward, putting their hands up for surrender, and are then unleashing their guns or setting off grenades, killing his men. So he has now said the only option, it is not normal rules of warfare, but is to actually order that his men shoot those foreigners fighting for the Taliban on sight. We will pass hopefully by them tomorrow and well away, we hope, from a battle which is to the death.
The roads and streets. I drove back myself to the old frontline area, and the roads were clogged with people doing the same. This is because people in Kabul have friends and relatives, close family, living in the Northern Alliance areas, and they couldn't visit them for years because of the fighting and because of the front line. So today they took the opportunity to go up the road and go and see their friends and family. Also, people were returning to the frontline areas to see what was left of their homes, and I have to say it was a little sadder to see that. People were going back to their villages and homes, and for mile upon mile on the frontline area is utterly devastated. Nothing but completely shattered villages, shattered homes. So people came off the city competing to carve it up first-hand. Now, what's particularly significant is that we got into Afghanistan via the Khyber Pass, the legendary impenetrable barrier for warring and invading armies over the centuries. And in the last 3 months, anyone really wanting to travel into Afghanistan, including journalists. Now, we burst through that border this afternoon, apparently with the tacit approval of the Pakistani government. The reason that we were the guests of Haji Zaman. He's a legendary Mujahideen warrior who fought against the Taliban and against the Soviets. He's been exiled for 6 years, and he returned home now to try and carve himself up a piece of this city. Now, we understand that Haji Qadir, who's the brother of the murdered leader Abdul Haq, is the new de facto governor of Jalalabad. But as to who gains the spoils from the rest of the city, that's very much...
From a jail in the south of the country by the Northern Alliance before being flown to safety in US Special Forces helicopters. 5 Charlotte Hume has the details.
Hello, love you, we're glad we're free.
What's your feeling?
Great! We feel wonderful, we're so excited that we're free. Thanks.
US aid workers Helen Mercer and Dana Curry relishing their newfound freedom. After 3 months imprisoned by the Taliban in Afghanistan, the 8 Western aid workers were released by opposition forces. US Special Forces then airlifted them to Pakistan.
It's like a miracle because just before Kabul fell, we were so excited to get out. We heard already the troops coming in, and then the Taliban came in and took us away and took us in a vehicle and wanted to take us to Kandahar. And we knew if we end up in Kandahar, we would not probably survive there. And then they stopped in the middle of the night at 1 o'clock and put us all into a steel container. And it was terrible cold, and they wanted to lock the container and leave us in there till the morning.
After an uprising, Northern Alliance troops set them all free.
I think this was one of the biggest days in my life.
They were detained on August the 3rd by the Taliban for preaching Christianity, a charge for which they faced the death penalty. Back home in Waco...
Good evening. The Taliban are still falling back on their strongholds tonight, apparently intent on a last stand against their enemies. Their leader, Mullah Omar, said they would fight to the death rather than to surrender to what he called fascists. The situation on the ground is confused, but it appears most of Afghanistan is now in the hands of the Northern Alliance or local warlords. In a moment, John Simpson in Kabul on new evidence of the extent of bin Laden's terror network. But first, Ben Brown from Jalalabad. He was one of the first reporters in after this important eastern city fell.
We drove into southern Afghanistan through the Khyber Pass. Refugees crammed the road, desperate to get home. We were told the route to Jalalabad could still be dangerous. There might be Taliban troops here who had just retreated from the city that was their stronghold. There was some gunfire, but it was only in celebration. And jubilant crowds lined the road. As night fell, we arrived in the center of Jalalabad and found heavily armed fighters ecstatic in their victory. They seized control from the Taliban yesterday, but never engaged them in battle. The Taliban just fled. The Americans have been bombing them right up until they left. The terrorists have finished, this fighter told me. They ran away. They'd gone up into the mountains, far away from the city.
As you can see, this city is brimming with guns and gunmen. But in the end, our understanding is Jalalabad fell with hardly a shot being fired. The Taliban simply turned and ran. The question now is who is going to replace them as the government of this beleaguered nation?
Amid the splendor of the palace in Jalalabad, a meeting tonight of the commanders and tribal leaders who now run this city. They are not the Northern Alliance. They are another anti-Taliban faction from the Pashtun ethnic group. They want to establish that Jalalabad is theirs now, not the Northern Alliance's. And the Pashtuns are demanding a hefty slice of power in the new Afghanistan. Outside the governor's palace this evening, an expectant crowd have gathered. They can hardly believe Jalalabad has fallen to them. After all, it was around here that Osama bin Laden himself spent much of his time and established many of his terrorist training camps. Now the challenge for all the victorious factions is to work with each other rather than wage war on each other, as they have done all too often in the past. Ben Brown, BBC News, Jalalabad.
In the last few minutes, it's been reported that around 100 British Royal Marines have flown into the Bagram Air Base outside Kabul. They're there to secure it as a base for future operations. In Kabul itself, more evidence has emerged today of the sinister ambitions of Osama bin Laden's terrorist network. John Simpson has been to one of its training centres in the city.
You know things are getting back to a kind of normality here when people start stripping down the wrecks left over from the fighting. This car was hit on Monday night by a rocket fired from an American helicopter. Contained 4 Arabs, all heavily armed and heading for the front line. They all died. The 4 had just left a house around the corner, which wasn't attacked by the Americans. Presumably they didn't know about it. Once it was used by the Saudi embassy, then by the UN. A year or so ago, it became a reception center for foreign volunteers coming to fight for the Taliban. Inside, it's a mess. We found that the Afghan Secret Service had been here before us. They'd taken away large amounts of documents, which will presumably find their way to the Americans and British. But they left quite a lot behind. Weapons and explosives, for example. There are hand grenades everywhere. For some reason, the volunteers hadn't taken them with them. But they had been trained here to use them. This wasn't just a reception center. The volunteers seem to have been taught to use weapons, and the Pakistanis among them were taught the rudiments of Arabic. But who precisely were they? And this hat is interesting. On it, it says Al-Sayqa, which is the new name for the Al-Qaeda organization, which is bin Laden's group. Maybe it was just coincidence, but there were some box cutters lying around. The weapon the hijackers used to take over the planes in the attacks of September the 11th. There's a pile of documents here which we found which haven't been taken away by the security authorities. Personal files. Here there's a passport from the Sudan. These were basically just small fry. Elsewhere, though, documents are coming to light which show how dangerous bin Laden's Al-Qaeda network aspired to be. This one describes how to create a thermonuclear explosion. These are notes on building a missile. Ricin is a powerful poison first developed by the Soviet KGB. As we left, they were clearing up the things the Taliban volunteers had left behind. Maybe the really dangerous-sounding documents on nuclear fission and missiles were just fantasy, but we can't yet be absolutely sure. John Simpson, BBC News, Kabul.
Northern Alliance forces have been accused of killing hundreds of Taliban soldiers trapped inside a school building in the battle for the northern city of Mazar-e Sharif. Reuters pictures from the city appear to show the demolished building and bodies removed from the wreckage. Scores of Taliban soldiers have been taken prisoner by Northern Alliance troops. Opposition forces are now in control of most key towns in the north of Afghanistan, except Kunduz, where thousands of Taliban soldiers are still holding out. Well, Ben Brown's in Jalalabad now. Ben, the collapse of the Taliban is creating a pretty confused situation on the ground.
Yes, Mike, very confused, and especially around here, we're not sure quite where the Taliban are. We know they've gone into retreat, but you have to be very careful driving around the roads here because you're not quite sure when they're going to be around the corner. In Jalalabad itself, it was quite a straightforward handover of power, almost gentlemanly, in fact. The Taliban left at 12 noon yesterday, and the old Mujahideen commanders who used to be in charge here just moved in. But there are no bodies in the gutters here. There are no Taliban.
The Taliban make good their promise to fight a guerrilla war. These are the kind of weapons that British and American soldiers will have to face in the mountains. But there are also signs that morale is collapsing. We came across this desperate throng of Afghan men at the border gates. Apparently, these are Taliban fighters who've downed their weapons and now want to flee their country. Like this man, waiting in a refugee camp to be treated for burns, apparently from an American bomb. No appetite here for more war. The coalition is still confronted by what could become a nightmare scenario.
The government wants to tackle the humanitarian crisis. A few days ago, American advisors were seen on the base with Northern Alliance troops. The British soldiers have been flown in to secure the base and assess the repairs needed to the runway to allow in large transport aircraft. The International Aid Secretary said she wanted troops sent quickly to help get food to 6 million people.
So it's the job of us and the US and other members of the coalition of the willing to get the troops on the ground as fast as possible to keep the stability and order.
The director of the World Food Programme said conditions were already much...
Departure. This is one of the houses that was used by the Arabs of Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda organization. I went there tonight and found immediate evidence of the link to terrorism. A bulletin in Arabic describing the current condition of Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, the man who is in prison in the United States for the first attempt to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993. In this and other houses, still more chilling documents have been found. They include descriptions of early nuclear weapons, like the plutonium bomb that destroyed Nagasaki, and references to ricin, a deadly poison. The clues left in the string of houses occupied by Osama bin Laden's Arabs in Kabul do not prove that the terrorists have weapons of mass destruction. But given the hint dropped by bin Laden himself in a recent interview with a Pakistani journalist that he possesses some kind of terrible deterrent, the threat must be taken seriously. Today, the Northern Alliance paraded for us some of the foreigners they say came to Afghanistan in response to bin Laden's call. These men are Pakistanis who, according to the alliance, were captured in the fighting with weapons in their hands. The prisoners denied it.
No guns. No, our guns. No.
The men claim that they came to Afghanistan to spread the Islamic message, an explanation their interrogators dismiss. The Pakistanis said that they were being well treated, but they looked frightened nonetheless. In the streets of Kabul, looters are now being arrested by the Northern Alliance as it seeks to assert its authority. These men were accused of stealing food from a UN warehouse. The soldiers went to a nearby house and made the owner dig up his yard to see if he had hidden some of the stolen food there. Operations like this, conducted in a Pashtun area where the alliance is disliked, may cause misgivings in the international community. But the change of power is bringing some normality to a city that for 5 years has lived under a religious tyranny. Satellite dishes are suddenly on sale, and CDs and video cassettes with pictures of unveiled women are appearing in the shops. But the war is still there.
I visited an Al-Qaeda training camp today. It was literally like a ghost town. There were training manuals strewn all over the floor, numerous heavy weapons they've been unable to take with them. These warlords, amongst them Haji Zaman, who's the brother of the executed Pashtun leader Abdul Haq, are trying to resolve their differences diplomatically. That's not the way problems have been settled here in the past. He who controls Jalalabad wields not only vast political influence, but also potential for the acquisition of huge wealth. I think what we're seeing here, for better or for worse, is a return to precisely the scenario. Come nightfall, the atmosphere turns very menacing. There's a curfew on tonight, which means that if I so much as leave the building I'm standing at the moment, I'll probably be shot at. And there's this abiding sensation that in an atmosphere...
Good evening. American officials scarcely concealed their jubilation today at the way they feel the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda terrorists are now on the run. They claim they've killed Osama bin Laden's principal lieutenant, and the Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld told reporters that US Special Forces were now killing Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters in southern Afghanistan. Washington is more cautious about other reports that the Taliban are on the brink of another humiliation, taking to the hills after being forced out of Kandahar, their southern spiritual base. From Washington, Gavin Hewitt reports.
During a bomb attack 2 days ago. If confirmed, this would be a major blow against the Al-Qaeda network. He was regarded as Osama bin Laden's heir apparent. Here he was with him at the marriage of his daughter to Osama bin Laden's son. Intelligence sources in America identify Mohammed Atif as the main planner behind the attacks on the World Trade Center.
Osama bin Laden no longer has a principal assistant that he has been counting on for developing military or terrorist operations.
That are trying to move from one place to another.
And reflecting the optimistic mood in Washington, the Defense Secretary wanted to show off pictures of American Special Forces in action.
The ones in the light camouflage garb are in fact American Special Forces.
On horseback.
On horseback in Afghanistan.
One role played by the American Special Forces, interrogating captured Taliban troops. Pressure continued today with further bombing of Kandahar, as these pictures from Al Jazeera show. One report from Afghanistan says that the Taliban leader, Mullah Mohammed Omar, has agreed to withdraw from the city. If that happens, the Americans hope demoralized Taliban fighters might deliver vital information on the whereabouts of Osama bin Laden. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Washington.
National Boat Service are preparing the airfield for aid flights and for possible military operations. Thousands of British paras and commandos could begin flying to Bagram over the weekend. From Kabul, John Simpson reports.
A Russian aircraft chartered from Iran brings in equipment for British troops in Afghanistan. They arrived yesterday evening, or perhaps even before, but details of their deployment here are as rare as glimpses of the men themselves. Their mission, at least, is clear. It's to secure Bagram Airport, install radar and communications, clear it of mines, and repair the runway to allow aid to be flown in the quantities Afghanistan desperately needs. But there's been confusion about their mission, and even quite senior figures in the Northern Alliance are complaining that they weren't consulted before the British troops arrived. Ordinary Afghans suspect the whole motivation behind their mission.
I think it's not a good news for us that the British soldier came to Afghanistan, because we have a lot of soldiers in Afghanistan, and all of our soldiers ready to beat Osama bin Laden, to capture him, and also to destroy him.
That kind of misunderstanding doesn't help the job the British are here to do. The area around Bagram is by no means untypical of the destruction this country has suffered in 20 years of war. It badly needs help. The Taliban only added to the misery, and their crimes are still coming to light.
Come in.
We went to a prison in Kabul where women had been held for crimes such as showing their face by accident in public. The man now in charge explained that virtually all the younger women had been taken away by Taliban soldiers when they escaped from Kabul earlier this week. The women's laundry still hangs on the line, but whether they themselves are alive or dead, and exactly why they were kidnapped, is still unknown. Sorting out all these problems requires immediate help from the outside world. One of the reasons for all the disasters here is the fact that the West forgot about Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal of 1989. If it forgets once more, this country could quickly find itself in trouble all over again. John Simpson, BBC News, Kabul.
Abandoned. Our special correspondent Ben Brown has been to two of them. Darunta, one of the largest in the hills to the west of Jalalabad, was reportedly used for chemical weapons training. The second camp, Farmhada, was based to 600 members of Al-Qaeda.
Just a few miles from Jalalabad, we came across what is left of one of the training camps run by the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. The deep craters show just how heavily the Americans bombed it. We were told hundreds of Arab fighters lived here in the Farmhada complex that's packed with armoured vehicles. Osama bin Laden used it as a key base from 1998 onwards. The camp is now in the hands of anti-Taliban troops. They gave us a guided tour. You have to be careful where you walk around here. Unexploded American cluster bombs litter the ground. They'll be a hazard in Afghanistan for months, maybe years to come. When the Taliban was still in power, the only pictures of bomb sites they wanted the world to see were those where there had been civilian casualties. But this is the other side of the coin. This was most definitely a military target. There were literally dozens of tanks and armoured personnel carriers here. What we haven't found are any bodies. But we've been told many Arab fighters did die in this camp. Those who survived the American onslaught here fled and carried their dead away with them. What's interesting is that while some of this heavy armour has been obliterated, other parts of it remain unscathed. If the Americans were trying to destroy all this hardware, then they failed, even after weeks of bombing. Suspicion of Vice, the religious police in other words, who confiscated cassette tapes and threw their owners into jail for daring to listen to music. They carried out raids on people's homes to seize television aerials and satellite dishes. TV was also banned under the Taliban. And these are the leather straps used to whip wrongdoers. 100 lashes.
They have sufficient troops of their own to conduct the humanitarian mission and settle the country down in preparation for peace. But with signs that the warlords' fragile alliance against the Taliban is already fracturing, if more British troops are deployed through the country, might they be caught in a crossfire? Here's Liz McKean.
Bagram Airport, just outside Kabul, now sees the first overt deployment of British troops in Afghanistan. Unlike the other special forces, we're told the role of the 100 SBS troops is strictly peaceful. They're to secure the airport, preparing the way for the forthcoming diplomatic and humanitarian missions. Although local Northern Alliance leaders have signalled they're not wanted, they could be joined by up to 4,000 more British troops who remain on standby. There's no word about how long they'll go for, or just how they'll stay out of harm's way. So what are they all getting into? The picture across Afghanistan is fractured and unstable. US bombers have been pounding Kandahar, as these pictures from the Al Jazeera agency show. Tonight the Taliban are reported to be pulling out of what was their stronghold. Favourite to move in is Hamid Karzai, one of 4 top warlords, now carving up the country between them. A moderate Pashtun leader backed by America, he told Newsnight tonight that Kandahar is there for the taking.
I plan to go to Kandahar very soon, together with other civilian leaders, and I hear already that there's trouble going on in Kandahar this afternoon, and I hear that the Taliban are on their way out, so I hope things will go on peacefully.
The Northern Alliance remain in control of Kabul for now at least. The capital is riven by different ethnic groups. At Kunduz, thousands of Taliban are mounting a desperate last stand against the Northern Alliance. In Mazar-e-Sharif, the alliance have admitted massacring at least 500 foreign Taliban troops. Control over Jalalabad is being disputed by at least 2 rival factions.
The ones in the light camouflage garb are in fact American Special Forces.
These latest additions to US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld's photo album show his special forces on horses fighting with the departing Taliban. But longer term, the peacekeepers can't rely on the support of American troops. As the Pentagon said, it believed one of bin Laden's main men, Mohammed Atef, had been killed by airstrikes. It made clear its troops weren't in for the long haul. While the remains of Afghanistan are picked over, a multinational stabilization force, presumably including these British forces on standby, will step into the breach. The UN is this weekend continuing its efforts to help Afghanistan towards the next stage, a workable government. The military campaign to oust the Taliban is working. The diplomatic campaign has a lot of catching up to do.
Liz McKean. Well, adding to the sense of uncertainty in Afghanistan, at least 1,000 heavily armed members of the Hazara tribe are now massing at the edge of Kabul. The Hazaras, the third largest ethnic group, recaptured their home province of Bamiyan from the Taliban following the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif. And now they've turned their attention to the capital in a bid to defend their fellow Shiite Muslims against feared persecution by the Tajik-dominated Northern Alliance. In this exclusive report, David Loyne travelled with them on their epic journey through the Hindu Kush Mountains to Kabul.
A short helicopter ride over the Hindu Kush, the high, wide mountain wastes which dominate the centre of Afghanistan. At the time we flew last weekend, the ground below was still in Taliban control, and in places we were only 100 feet above the ground. It is not surprising that very few helicopters flew between the patches of land then outside Taliban hands. And what did they carry to supply armies at war? Not guns or ammunition, but money. Bales and bales of banknotes, the fuel needed to raise an army in the poorest region in one of the poorest countries in the world. On hand to supervise the delivery, the shadowy figures who conducted the campaign, Special Forces soldiers from the United States. That night, they began their assault on the Taliban in Bamiyan, in a battle where horses did most of the work. Here, there are few vehicles other than relics from the Russian era a generation ago. This jeep needed to be helped on its way by men who earned food for their families mending the roads. The food for work is distributed in the town of Yakovlang, alongside food given out for free by Oxfam to the poorest families from the hills. Yakovlang was the scene of one of the greatest atrocities of the Taliban era, when more than 200 men and a number of women and children were shot and the whole town burnt to the ground. Hundreds of other people were killed in raids on the surrounding villages earlier this year. And amid the ethnic cleansing, in one shop we found the remains of piles of burnt money. With their Arab bankers, the Taliban had money to burn. A few days later, after the Hazara army with the help of their American backers had forced the Taliban out of their homeland, we caught up with our money again, the cash which had come by air. Every man was to get 50,000 Afghanis, about £1 a day, for a new and more controversial task. Leaving behind their one tank newly captured from the Taliban and the remains of one of their enemies lying in a ditch, the Hazaras are on their way to the capital. They gathered in a dramatic dawn meeting, beginning with a Hazara nationalist prayer.
When you enter the city, most of you may not know it very well, you should observe military order. When you go anywhere, you have to try your best to respect the people and value their honor.
The word Hazara comes from the Persian for 1,000, and they have raised an army of 1,000 for the move on the capital. They are around 20% of the population of Afghanistan and do not want to be forgotten. They came down from the mountains through a landscape only just freed from the Taliban, and they were in good spirits as they travelled into the night until they stopped half a day's drive away from the capital itself, waiting for further orders. Here, every soldier, down to a boy who they said is just 9 years old, filled their magazines with bullets.
But he's very young, he shouldn't be a soldier.
Because he is very character, he is very intelligent boy.
Yeah.
He's very intelligent boy.
He should be in school if he's very intelligent.
Yeah. He was in school, but when the fighting started to his province, he took gun.
Iwaz told me he has killed Taliban fighters most recently in the battle for Bamyan this week. And when I asked him why, he said he fought for freedom. He was coached in his answers by a commander only twice his age who has himself been fighting since he was a boy. And now they wait to negotiate the exact terms of their entrance to Kabul. Many of these men had relatives killed by the Tajik army who are now in the capital in fighting in the early 1990s, and they fear it could happen again.
It was, I suppose, inevitable that once Kabul had fallen, other armies would try to reach the city. The failure of the international community to secure a political settlement before the fall of the capital means that once again in Afghanistan, political ambition needs to be backed up with military muscle.
Their leader is planning to take the troops in with him when he goes next week, and he swats aside questions as if every politician in the world takes 1,000 armed men around with him.
It's my home. I return to my home. It's not a crime if I go on my own or with 2,000 men. We are not going to fight there. We hate fighting.
Ustav Halili says there was an agreement that the UN would go in first, which was broken. He is looking for order.
We have to find a logical solution for the problems of Afghanistan. We need a central system. Then, when we capture a region, we can control it.
As we finished our interview this morning, there was an extraordinary arrival. Former Taliban commanders came for talks. They control land between the Hazara homeland and the capital, and they still control it now that the Arabs and Pakistanis have gone or been killed. American political advisors were again waiting in the wings. We bumped into the Taliban again by chance when they broke down on the road. Local men of influence still negotiating the destiny of their region while converting to the latest cause to keep in power. They carried their weapons through the Hazara area. But the town where they negotiated with Ustav Halili shows scars of the horrors of the last 5 years, which are also carried around in the minds of the people.
I was in my house when the Taliban came and arrested me in my house. They took me to the place that they killed more people. I saw all the killed people. They wanted to kill me, but they quarreled between them.
So what was in your mind when they were quarreling for your life?
I was thinking about my life. Just, I didn't believe that I will be alive.
You went to prison, but some people never even made it to the prison. I think they died along the way.
Yeah, they wanted to carry, the Taliban wanted to carry them to Jawzjan prison. But during the way, they died. And the container, you know container? Yeah.
The Hazara leader addressed his people during Friday prayers for the first time in a liberated Hazara region. He said they must remember the horrors, but move on in the spirit of the people now returning from exile in the mountains to rebuild Bamyan, although the Buddhas cannot be rebuilt. The iconoclasts have gone. Their work in Bamyan cannot be restored, but restoration of Afghanistan must begin. Many of the men who crammed the mosque and the area outside today were visibly moved at their leader's words.
Mohammed Attaf was said to have been killed in an American airstrike near Kabul earlier this week. There were other unconfirmed reports today that the Taliban leader Mullah Omar has agreed to pull out of Kandahar, the Taliban's last stronghold in Afghanistan, by tomorrow.
Troops in Afghanistan. Royal Marine Commandos, reputedly members of the Special Boat Service, on the roof of a wrecked aircraft hangar at the Bagram Air Base, which is now securely in Northern Alliance hands. The first mission of the 100-man British team is reconnaissance, to evaluate the situation around Bagram and assess the condition of the runways. Hundreds more British troops may arrive within days. They will clear a pathway to the Afghan capital for humanitarian supplies. They may also use Bagram as a launchpad for missions against Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network. The British government has promised that they will not be